Honestly, I probably should have just tossed that letter in the trash. 7 days to take down a fence on my own property. Yeah, right. But it was the way Vera Vance came striding up my driveway like she ran the whole county that really got under my skin. Ever had a neighbor like that? The kind who treats rules like weapons but can't grasp personal boundaries. What started as a squabble over a fence ended with me putting the land beneath her house up for auction. If your HOA has ever pulled some nonsense, drop it in the comments. This is QE Stories. I'm Harlan Thorne, and until about 6 months back, I figured I was living a quiet, peaceful life. I run a small landscaping business and train horses out here. Nothing fancy, just honest, hands in the dirt work. My place is tucked away at the end of Maple Grove Lane, a neighborhood that, if you ask me, has gotten a little too big for its boots. I've got about 5 acres, which around here means I'm that guy with all the land. And you know how people start acting when they think you've got more than your share. Most days, I keep to myself, me, the horses, and whatever jobs need doing. Let everyone else obsess over their trimmed hedges and color-matching mailboxes. But I should have known that kind of quiet couldn't last, not with someone like Vera Vance running the show. Thinking back now, I wish I'd trusted that feeling in my gut. There was always something about the way she looked at my fence, like she was already planning how to tear it down. She showed up on a Tuesday morning in March. I saw her from a good 50 yards away and knew immediately this wasn't going to be a social call. Vera's in her mid-50s, retired from some high-ranking bank job, and carries herself like she's still out there crushing loan applications and foreclosing on dreams. She drives a white Lexus so spotless it could pass for new and had on one of those blazers that screams, "Where's your manager?" From across town, I was in the middle of fixing up a section of my stone fence when I spotted her stomping up the drive, clipboard in hand, never a promising sign. I don't even know why I didn't just duck inside. But something about the way she marched up told me she wasn't leaving without getting in my face. In hindsight, that was the moment I should have realized my quiet life was about to come apart. "Mr. Thorne," she said, before she'd even made it halfway, like she was kicking off a shareholders meeting. "I'm Vera Vance, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, and we need to talk about your fencing situation." Fencing situation like it was a plumbing disaster or a full-blown IRS audit. I stood up and gave her a once-over. This woman had somehow decided my fence was her business. It's a fieldstone fence I built myself over a few weekends, 4 feet high, and running along the road at the edge of my land. Real craftsmanship. I was proud of it. But judging by the look on Vera's face, you'd think I'd built a junkyard. Out of rusted metal and barbed wire. What kind of person looks at a solid, hand-built stone fence and sees a neighborhood problem? "That ugly rock wall," she said, flinging her hand toward it like it had personally insulted her. "It makes the neighborhood look like an abandoned farm. We've received several complaints. It ruins the aesthetic flow of the community." For a second, I thought she had to be kidding. I blinked, checked her face again. Nope, dead serious. I still don't know why I didn't just burst out laughing. Aesthetic flow. This from a neighborhood with plastic flamingos in some yards and spinning dollar store pinwheels in others. But there she stood, clipboard in hand, face stone cold, like she was about to slap me with a subpoena, so I crossed my arms and waited. Something told me this conversation was just getting started. She kept darting glances at her notes, which told me this little visit wasn't off the cuff. She'd planned every second of it. "The board has made a decision," she declared, with the gravity of a federal judge. "You have 7 days to take down this eyesore voluntarily. If you don't, we'll have to pursue stronger action." I asked what exactly that meant, and her expression twisted into something straight out of a nature doc. Like a predator that had just found its prey. "The HOA is fully authorized to force the sale of properties that refuse to comply with regulations, Mr. Thorne. We'd rather avoid that, but we will protect our property values at all costs." I almost laughed again. I wanted to ask what dusty rulebook gave her that kind of authority, but something about the way she said it made me pause. Was she bluffing? Or had she actually done this before? Did she just threaten to sell off my land over a fence? On land that I own? I just stared at her. wondering if I'd accidentally wandered into some twisted reality where HOA presidents had the power to snatch homes away. She spoke with the kind of confidence that only comes from experience, and I couldn't help but wonder how many other neighbors had backed down when she pulled this same move. I didn't argue, not yet. Something about this whole thing didn't sit right. Like there was more going on than just a fence complaint, so I stood there, arms folded, while she rattled off legal jargon about community standards and property values. In my head, all I could think was, "Lady, you just made a mistake." She kept going for another 5 minutes, tossing out terms like precedent and fiduciary duty. But what really struck me was how sure she seemed about being able to force a property auction. That kind of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. Had anyone in the neighborhood ever pushed back? Had anyone ever checked whether she actually had the legal power she claimed? Maybe I was just being suspicious. But when I asked if she was sure the HOA's own structures were legally built, the flicker in her eyes told me plenty. When she finally wrapped her speech, she handed me a letter with the HOAS logo stamped at the top and a deadline marked, in red, 7 days. "I trust you'll make the right choice for everyone involved," she said, as she turned and walked back to that showroom clean Lexus. I had a growing sense that Vera Vance was way too comfortable flexing her authority. Looked down at the letter, then back at my fence. And that's when the smile hit me. "Are you absolutely certain everything the HOA's built is legal?" I called after her. She froze mid-step, turned, and looked at me, eyes wide for just a second before snapping back into that frosty glare. No reply. She just climbed into her car and pulled away. I stood there, watching her go, and asked myself, should I just tear the thing down and avoid the fight? Or start digging, because something told me that fence was just the start of a much deeper mess. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Vera's letter in hand, and a growing sense that this whole thing didn't add up. 7 days to dismantle a legal fence on my property, or face a forced sale. That's an awful lot of power for a homeowners association. Especially one I wasn't even sure I belonged to. C. My land sits at the end of the street, kind of on its own. I never actually confirmed whether I was part of the HOA or not. Hadn't signed anything that I could remember, but maybe something was buried in the fine print. I needed answers. I'm not the type to comb through legal papers, but Vera's arrogance had rubbed me raw. She was so certain, so sure she was in the right. And I kept wondering, had anyone ever challenged her? I couldn't stop thinking about that flicker in her eyes when I brought up the legality of HOA construction. So I started digging through every piece of paperwork I had from when I bought the property: deed, title, survey, insurance. The works. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I do know how to read a property survey. And what I found made my stomach drop. Turns out, my property line extended way farther than I thought. It didn't stop where I assumed. It pushed right into what I always believed was community space. That stretch of land at the front of the neighborhood, the landscaped entrance with the welcome sign, the flower beds, even the security cameras. It was mine. Every single rock, shrub, and pole had been built on my land. I froze, staring at the paperwork. Thought maybe I'd misread it. Looked again, measured it out. Then I leaned back and laughed. I read that survey 3 times just to be sure. The HOA had put up their whole front entrance on my land, never asked, never paid, never acknowledged it. And for 8 years, while I minded my own business and kept the peace, they'd been squatting on my property, and now they were threatening to sell my house over a perfectly legal fence. The hypocrisy was so thick, you could have scooped it with a shovel. Vera had been squatting on my land for 8 years, yet here she was, demanding I clear it. Looking back now, I probably should have been more furious, but in that moment, I was mostly just stunned by the sheer gall of it all. This woman had been lecturing me about respecting property rights, while trampling mine for nearly a decade. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to the edge of the property to see exactly what we were dealing with. I'll admit, the HOA's entrance setup was impressive. A massive stone sign read Maple Grove Estates, surrounded by neatly landscaped flowers, uplighting, and a couple of security cameras trained on the road. You could tell they dropped 15, maybe 20 grand on ETAND. Yeah, it did make the place look nicer, but, according to my survey, every inch of it was planted 15 feet over my boundary. 15 feet, that wasn't a minor surveying hiccup or a fuzzy border issue. That was a serious chunk of real estate they'd been treating like it was theirs. I stood there in the dark, watching their elaborate sign basking in light from fixtures, plugged into my own electrical box, and I started to wonder how many others had she steamrolled. How many people had been buried under her HOA notices and full legal threats? The longer I stared at that expensive setup squatting on my land, the hotter my blood got, and the questions started to pile up. Had she pulled this stunt with other neighbors? Was this whole HOA just a personal fiefdom built on scare tactics and land grabs? I didn't know if I was being overly dramatic, or if I'd just peeled back the first layer of something much bigger. But one thing was obvious. She'd chosen the wrong person to try and intimidate. I didn't call her right away. I figured I'd let her walk a little further into her own mess. If she wanted to play games over property lines, I was going to make sure I had every piece of documentation in order. Before making my move, the smart approach was to get everything verified and on the record, before she realized just how badly she'd overplayed her hand. I also started to wonder what other shady shortcuts the HOA had taken under her watch. If they were this reckless with boundaries, what else had they bungled? The following morning, I contacted a professional surveyor, not the original guy, but someone completely independent who could confirm what I was seeing. I also started photographing everything: the sign, the flowers, the lights, the cameras, every bit of it clearly sitting on my land. A part of me felt a little petty. But then I remembered Vera's threat to auction off my house, and whatever guilt I had vanished instantly. She opened this can of worms with her 7-day ultimatum and her speech about preserving property values at all costs. Fine now. She was going to learn what real property protection looked like, courtesy of someone who actually knew his rights. I also started logging everything, every exchange, every threat, every claim she made about the HOA's so-called authority. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence, and I couldn't help but smile. So Vera wanted to play games. All right, let's play. But as I kept digging into those boundary lines and what it all could mean, a darker thought started to creep in. If they were this sloppy with my property, what other shady stuff had they done? What other rules had been quietly bent or broken? They built up their little kingdom. Maybe I was just scratching the surface. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized Vera's 7-day countdown wasn't a threat, it was the timer on her own unraveling. 4 days later, she made her move. I opened the mailbox to find a certified letter, the kind that practically drips with legalese. It read like it had been written by a team of lawyers, billing by the syllable, 3 pages long and dense enough to bend light. The message: tear down the fence or risk losing your house. But the kicker. Attached to the threat was a notice for a community meeting, scheduled for Saturday to publicly discuss how my supposed violations were impacting the neighborhood. She was setting up a public trial. Neighbors as jurors. Me as the defendant. I had to read it twice to believe it. A community meeting over a 4-foot fence. She wanted to drag me in front of my neighbors like I was some kind of criminal. Say what you want, the woman didn't do anything halfway. Her legal authority might be held together with tape and wishful thinking, but her flair for theatrics unmatched it. It made me wonder how many other people had she cowed into silence with this kind of nonsense. The notice said the meeting would be held at 7 p.m. at the local community center. The agenda: my non-compliant stone fence that allegedly broke the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines and endangered property values in the prestigious Maple Grove estates. I had to laugh. She was calling a public meeting to shame me over a fence on my own land while she'd been squatting on mine for nearly a decade. Either she had nerves of steel or no clue just how deep in trouble she really was. Maybe both. I thought about crashing the meeting with my survey in hand, shutting down the whole performance on the spot. But something told me to let her keep digging. I wanted to see how far she'd take it before the reality hammer dropped. Saturday night rolled around, and I showed up to find the place packed. 20, maybe 25 neighbors had turned out. Vera had clearly pitched this like it was the trial of the century. She had the projector going, handouts, charts like it was a board meeting. Not a neighborhood spat over a few feet of stonework. I sat quietly in the back and watched her glide through the room, shaking hands and working. The crowd like she was up for re-election. Say what you want. She could work a room. She had everything ready, photos of my fence taken at dramatic angles, charts supposedly showing declining property values, even a full-on PowerPoint about preserving community aesthetics, animations, and all honestly, I half expected her to accuse me of tanking local Zillow estimates. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my fence. This was about control. A warning shot to the rest of the neighborhood: step out of line, and you'll be next. When she finally called the meeting to order, she dove into what can only be described as a courtroom-style monologue. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here tonight because one resident's failure to comply with community standards jeopardizes everything we've built here at Maple Grove Estates. She cycled through photos of my fence like they were evidence in a high-profile criminal case. This unapproved stone structure disrupts the neighborhood's cohesive visual identity and sets a dangerous precedent. I had to stifle a laugh. She actually called my fence an unauthorized stone structure. I couldn't decide if I should be insulted or give her points for theatrical language. To hear her tell it. You'd think I'd erected a fortress wall in the middle of a coal-dash-to-dash sack. She droned on for 15 minutes, portraying me as the rogue homeowner, bringing down the entire housing market. She even brought testimonials, neighbors complaining about how the fence altered the visual experience of their morning commute. A few people nodded along or spoke up, mostly echoing her scripted concerns about standards and aesthetics. Let her keep going. Every PowerPoint slide, every made-up regulation, more fuel for my case. Every exaggerated claim about the HOA's power, just more evidence stacked in my favor. I noticed a few neighbors giving me subtle, sympathetic glances, but most seemed convinced by her little production. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A neighbor from a few doors down raised a hand and asked, "Vera, are you absolutely certain the HOA has the legal right to auction off someone's property? That feels ... extreme for a fence issue." Her answer, priceless. She straightened up and declared, with full confidence, "Absolutely. Maple Grove HOA is fully empowered to enforce compliance by whatever means necessary, including forced property auctions. We've done it before and won't hesitate to do it again." And that was it. That sentence right there was the goldmine. She just publicly claimed they'd forcibly taken homes in the past and intended to do the same to me. With witnesses, I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. She'd just handed me everything I needed, and didn't even realize it. While she threw around legal threats like party favors, I quietly took notes. Every bold claim, every declaration of power, every vague reference to past enforcement. She wasn't just embarrassing herself, she was building my case. Line by line. As the meeting wrapped up and people began to trickle out, a few neighbors came up to me quietly. "Can they really do that? Have they actually auctioned off someone's home before? What are you going to do now?" I just smiled and told them, "Guess we'll all find out soon enough." I could read the fear in their expressions. If Vera was bold enough to threaten me over a fence backed by legal documentation, what might she do to them over smaller issues? After most of the attendees had cleared out, she approached me wearing the same predator's grin she'd flaunted at my property line. "I trust tonight helped make things a little clearer for you. Harlan," she said smoothly, "this isn't personal, it's just business. But rules are rules, and we're tasked with making sure they're followed." I met her gaze and replied evenly, "Couldn't agree more, Vera. Rules are rules. And everyone should be held accountable to the same ones." Something in the way I said it seemed to catch her off guard. She paused just long enough to suggest she was trying to decode a double meaning, but eventually gave a slight nod and turned away, probably believing she'd claimed another win. I walked to my truck. I couldn't help but wonder, was I just dragging my feet, or was I setting the perfect trap? The surveyor arrived promptly at 8 a.m. on Thursday, 2 days before Vera's deadline was set to expire. I'd gone with Peterson and Associates, a local firm with over 3 decades of experience, chosen specifically for their reputation for rock-solid precision. When Tom Peterson stepped out with his crew, and the kind of high-end equipment that makes attorneys break a sweat, I knew things were about to get interesting. The man had been doing this long before GPS was mainstream, and if he said something was on my land, that was gospel. I explained everything, the HOA threats, the fence dispute, and my doubts about their so-called entrance features. His reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. "Well, let's find out what we're really dealing with," he said, with the calm authority of someone who's mediated more land disputes than he can count. While his team started setting up their gear, I laid out the timeline and the stakes. They spent about 3 hours mapping my boundaries using both GPS and old-school methods to ensure every measurement was right. I watched them set up, take readings, consult their maps and tablets, everything double-checked. Every boundary marker placed with total precision. When they finally called me over to review the findings, I could tell by the look on Tom's face that something big had come up. "Mr. Thorne," he began, pointing to the bright orange stakes now lining the real boundary of my land, "this is going to make things with your neighbor a whole lot more complicated." The tone of surprise, mixed with professional seriousness, told me the results had gone far beyond what I had hoped for. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was a legal powder keg, and I was ready to light the fuse. The final report was even more explosive than expected. According to the survey, the HOA's entrance sign was sitting a full 12 feet inside my property. The fancy landscaping extended 15 feet over the line. The security cameras that had been quietly monitoring the neighborhood for years, 8 feet into my yard, and those massive stone pillars, easily $5,000 each, were 10 feet deep into my lot. Every single piece of Maple Grove's grand entrance, the sign, the lights, the plants was illegally encroaching on my property. And now, I had the ironclad documentation to prove it. Tom handed over a detailed packet, precise measurements, high-resolution photos, and GPS coordinates, evidence that could hold up in any courtroom. As I reviewed the data, I found myself wondering how the HOA had managed to get it this wrong for so long. "In all my years doing this," Tom said, shaking his head, "I've never seen a property line mess up this extreme." News of the survey spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, faster than Sunday gossip at the town diner. By that afternoon, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Some neighbors were just curious. "Harlan, is it true? Did they really build on your land?" Others were anxious about what it meant for their own homes. "If they botched your lines, what about ours?" A few even stopped by in person to check out the survey markers. One woman from Cedar Drive brought her own tape measure. She needed to see the numbers for herself. I welcomed the attention. The more people saw, the harder it would be for Vera to hide behind HOA rules. Her grip on the neighborhood was starting to loosen it. She didn't even know it yet. But things really heated up when Vera heard about the survey. She called Thursday evening, and for the first time since this drama began, her voice lacked its usual steel. "Harlan," she said, feigning casualness, "I heard some absurd claims about property lines and survey stakes. You know how unreliable those old surveys can be, especially with big lots like yours, right?" There was a hint of desperation in her tone, like she was hoping I'd dismiss the whole thing as a big misunderstanding. When I told her I'd had the land professionally surveyed by Peterson and Associates, the silence that followed stretched so long, I thought she might have hung up. "We should probably meet," I said. She agreed to stop by the next morning. Her voice wasn't nearly as steady this time. She was finally starting to realize how deep this hole really was. When Vera arrived Friday morning, she looked like sleep had abandoned her the night before. Gone was the smug HOA president who'd once threatened to auction off my home. Now, she was a woman staring down serious consequences. Led her along the property line, pointing out each stake and explaining what it all meant. When we got to the entrance sign, and I told her it was 12 feet onto my land, her face went pale. "This is just a minor technicality," she said shakily. "We can work something out. Maybe a small rental fee to make it all official." The same woman who had threatened to take my home was now begging to rent the land. She'd been squatting on for 8 years. I watched her, likely trying to do the math in her head how much this would cost the HOA. I figured it was time to lay it all out. "Vera," I said calmly, "last week, you threatened to auction off my house over a fence that's entirely legal and on my land. Now I find out you've been building on my property for nearly a decade. How do you think this looks?" She tried to spin. It claimed it was all an honest mistake, the kind that happens with older plots, but I could see it in her eye. She knew how bad it really was. When she finally walked back to her Lexus, shoulders heavy with dread, I knew the game had flipped. The question wasn't whether I could keep my fence anymore. It was what I was going to do about 8 years of illegal use and whether Vera was going to finally pay for her intimidation tactics. So what do you do in that position? Take a small settlement and move on, or teach a lesson about respecting boundaries? As she drove away, I realized I had a choice. Become the local hero, or the guy who went too far. That Friday night, I sat at my desk and composed what I can only describe as the most satisfying email I've ever written. Thanks to Vera's commitment to community transparency, the entire Maple Grove resident directory was public and I was about to deliver some truth with a capital T. Subject line: important property line information for all Maple Grove residents. The tone was professional, but straight to the point. I explained the fence dispute, the survey results, and what it all meant for the neighborhood. This isn't about payback, I told myself. This is about setting the record straight. But let's be honest, it felt good knowing Vera was about to get a dose of her own medicine. The email laid it all out. The HOA's threats, the survey's findings, the photos, the documentation. Then came the kicker. Since Mrs. Vance seems to believe property auctions are a valid solution to disputes, I wrote, I'll be hosting one of my own for the land under her entrance sign. Just following her example. I knew that line would make waves. But more importantly, I wanted the community to see the truth. The person threatening to take a neighbor's home had been trespassing on that same neighbor's land for years. Looking back, this was the kind of tale people love: a bully, finally getting knocked down, but living through it. That's a whole different beast. That I hit send at 10 p.m. on Friday. The response was almost immediate. Within minutes, the calls started. People do check email on Friday nights when there's drama too. B had. The first few were stunned. Harlan, did you really say Vera's house is on your land? Are you actually auctioning off her lot? Is this for real? I patiently walked each person through the survey results, legal implications, and what Vera had done. By midnight, I'd fielded 15 calls. Most were equal parts disbelief, outrage, and curiosity. She tried to auction your place while squatting on your property, was the line I heard most. Saturday brought a new wave of reactions. Some neighbors were fully on board. Good for you, Harlan. She had it coming. Others were uneasy. This is spiraling. Can't we settle this quietly? But the most revealing comments came from those with stories of their own people Vera had threatened before. A woman on Oak Street told me how Vera once demanded she remove her backyard vegetable garden. Someone from Pine Avenue said they had to repaint their house because Vera thought the color didn't meet the community aesthetic. One thing became clear: my fence was just the latest target in a long line of control games. Then came the call I'd been waiting for. Around noon, it was Verand. She was livid. You can't do this, she shouted. This is harassment. This is extortion. I'll sue you for everything. I let her rant before calmly replying, Vera, I'm just playing by your rules, remember. You said auctions were a valid way to resolve disputes. The silence that followed was thunderous. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, smaller, more desperate. Harlan, please, we can fix this. My grandkids come to that house. It's more than just a building to me. For a split second, I almost felt bad. Almost. But then, I remembered her threats and any sympathy evaporated. This was about consequences. All weekend, the neighborhood buzzed, people picked sides. Team Harlan gained traction fast as more stories surfaced about Vera's heavy-handed ways. Even her longtime supporters began questioning if she'd gone too far. Saturday was filled with neighbors dropping by or calling to understand what it all meant legally, practically, and personally. Some were worried about their own boundaries. Others were just glad someone was finally standing up to Vera. The consensus: she'd been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for way too long. By Sunday night, I sent out the final announcement. The auction would take place the following Saturday at 10 a.m. in the community center. All are welcome, I wrote. Might as well turn her drama into an open house. The tone was light, but the message was loud and clear. This was happening. And as I hit send, I felt a mix of triumph and uncertainty. Justice was finally catching up to someone who had abused their authority for years. But I also knew, come Saturday, I'd either be the local hero, the man who pushed too far. Either way, Vera started this, and I was going to finish it in a way no one would ever forget. Saturday morning arrived, crisp and electric, the kind of fall day you can feel in your bones. And I knew, without a doubt, that Maple Grove was about to witness a day it would never forget. I had hired Jim Morrison, a veteran auctioneer with 2 decades of experience, to handle everything professionally. The setup in the community center was already underway. Game on. Word of the auction spread fast far beyond our little street. I started getting calls from folks in neighboring counties who'd caught wind of the unfolding drama and wanted front row seats. It was hard to wrap my head around the fact that a dispute over a fence had snowballed into the biggest suburban showdown in years. But honestly, I was just ready to see it through. A reporter from the local paper even reached out for a quote, but I figured I'd let the auction speak for itself. By 9:45 a.m., the community center was packed. I'd anticipated a decent turnout from nearby residents, but this was next level. Over 60 people were jammed into a space typically used for HOA meetings of maybe half that size. I recognized about half the crowd. The rest, onlookers, real estate scouts, and what I assumed were more journalists eager for a juicy neighborhood scoop. The room crackled with tension like a courtroom moments before a verdict. People murmured quietly, as if loud voices might ignite something. Some gave me encouraging nods like I was some kind of local legend. Others stared like I was about to strike a match in a fireworks warehouse. A few looked genuinely unsettled. I spotted several folks recording, which told me this saga wasn't staying local for long. Then, at 9:55, Vera walked in. Her face was drawn, her shoulders sagging as if she'd spent the night negotiating with regrets. The woman who once barked out orders like a general now moved like a weary principal headed into a disciplinary hearing. She looked defeated, like someone bracing for the collapse of everything they'd built, and she came alone. No lawyer, no backup from the HOA board, just Vera. She took a front row seat, eyes locked on the podium where Jim Morrison was laying out his materials. When our eyes met, I saw something unfamiliar in her expression. Not rage, not arrogance. Real fear, the kind that hits when you realize you've gone too far, and there's no undoing it. For a split second, I hesitated. Was I crossing a line? But then I remembered her threat to auction off my home. That flicker of doubt vanished. Dotted exactly. Las 10 a.m. Jim Morrison called the room to order, and silence fell like a curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Today, we auction the land rights to Lot 27 in Maple Grove Estates, currently occupied by Mrs. Verna Vance. Opening bid, $50,000 for exclusive land rights, with any existing structures to negotiate terms with the winning bidder. His words echoed like a death sentence, and I watched Vera sink deeper into her chair. You could feel the discomfort ripple through the crowd as the reality of what was about to happen truly hit. Neighbors looked back and forth between Vera and Me, probably wondering whether this was long overdue justice or just vengeance going nuclear. Before the first bid was placed, Vera abruptly stood and turned to the crowd. "This is wrong," she said, voice trembling. "He's trying to steal my home. One mistake with the property lines, and now he's destroying everything I've built." The room held its breath. For a moment, I could see some people start to waver, but then a neighbor from Oak Street stood and said, "One mistake, Vera. You tried to sell his land over a perfectly legal fence." Others chimed in. Story after story poured out, neighbors venting years of frustration about Vera's rule. "She made me repaint my whole house. Tried to shut down my vegetable garden. She's been intimidating people for years." The room transformed into a chorus of long-suppressed complaints. Bidding began slowly. Many of the neighbors seemed uneasy about the situation, and $50,000 was no small sum for a neighborhood dispute. But the outside investors, they were just getting warmed up. $60,000, $65,000, $70,000 each. New bid brought Vera closer to tears. The tension in the room kept rising. I stood in the back, watching it all unfold, feeling an odd mix of satisfaction and something like regret. After all, this was the woman who had tried to take my home. But watching her fall apart in front of everyone, well, it wasn't easy. Some in the crowd looked like they were enjoying the show. Others looked like they wanted to disappear. When bidding hit $75,000, Vera desperately tried to get in the game. But she didn't have the funds. She was sobbing, now pleading with neighbors to help, offering to tear down the structures on my land, and even step down as HOA president if I'd just stop the auction. Jim Morrison began his chant, going once, going twice, and suddenly, everything inside me froze. In 10 seconds, Vera would lose her home, and I'd be the one who made it happen. I looked at her completely undone and had to ask myself, was I righting a wrong or becoming exactly what she used to be? The gavel lifted. I had 5 seconds to decide the kind of man I wanted to be. And just before it dropped, I raised my hand. "I bid $80,000, I said. The room fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Vera stared at me like I was speaking another language, her face a blend of confusion, disbelief, and maybe hope. Why would I bid on land I already owned? Because I had a message to send on. It was time to show everyone what real leadership looked like. As the winning bidder, I now legally held the rights to the land under Vera's house. I could do whatever I wanted, but I didn't want destruction. I wanted justice. Real justice. And sometimes, that means showing grace when you have every reason not to. I stood up. "I never wanted Vera to lose her home," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I just wanted her to feel what it's like when someone threatens your security, your legacy. Now that she does, maybe we can finally rebuild, this time on something solid." I turned to Vera. She was still crying. But there was something else in her eyes, now maybe even hope. "I'm willing to offer you a fair lease, so you can stay," I continued. "But there are conditions." The room began buzzing. No one had seen this coming, including me, honestly. "First," I said, "you step down as HOA president, effective immediately, and for good. Second, you help us draft new community guidelines that support residents, not bully them. And third, you pay back fair compensation for the 8 years you've been using my land without permission." Vera nodded so hard, I thought she might hurt herself. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper, then louder, "Yes, anything, thank you." You could feel the pressure in the room lift. Some people started clapping. The mood shifted from revenge to resolution. It was mercy, not wrath, that stole the show. More neighbors joined in, applauding the unexpected end to what could have been a total disaster. Even some of the outside investors looked genuinely impressed. Turns out, people respect mercy more than scorched earth. Over the following weeks, we completely restructured the Maple Grove HOA. Gone were the threats and power plays that defined Vera's leadership. We brought in transparency. Every major decision was now voted on publicly. No more weaponizing the HOA for personal vendettas. No more secret property decisions. We created a system where leadership rotated every year so no one could hoard, control, and, most importantly, we added a rule: before anything could be built on someone's land, that owner had to give written consent. Wild how well things work when you follow the law and treat people like people. Once the lawyers stepped in, sorting out the property details was surprisingly straightforward. The HOA agreed to remove everything they'd built on my land within 30 days and paid me $25,000 for the 8 years of unauthorized use. My fence. It stayed put, fully legal and officially acknowledged. We recorded clear property lines for every lot in the neighborhood and passed rules requiring written permission for any shared development. Turns out, mutual respect works better than fear. By Thanksgiving, everything was resolved. And within 6 months, our neighborhood had transformed. Property values went up thanks to our new, transparent management. People started choosing to move to Maple Grove because we had what one realtor called the fairest HOA in the county. No more compliance out of fear. No more silent meetings full of tension. No more tyrants with clipboards issuing ultimatums. Instead, we had real events, community picnics, movie nights. People smiled. They actually liked living here now. And Vera, she kept her word, stepped down, helped write the new rules, paid what she owed without argument. To my surprise, she actually seemed happier, free of the need to control everything. She started volunteering at the local animal shelter, even became a decent neighbor. Sometimes I see her tending her garden, and we exchange waves like old friends. One day, she even said, "Thank you for showing me who I used to be." Didn't expect that now. As I sit on my porch, looking at the same stone fence that started this wild ride, I see peace. The fence still stands. Still beautiful. Still exactly where it belongs. Horses grazing in the background. Neighbors walking by, waving instead of rushing past, afraid of getting written up. That so-called unauthorized stone wall. It's become a landmark. Visitors ask about it. Locals call it the fence that brought down a tyrant and rebuilt a community. Funny thing I learned: the loudest voices often stand on the weakest ground. Vera's power was never real. It came from silence. From people too tired or too scared to fight back. But when someone finally de-armed with facts, not fear, her authority collapsed. And yet, I could have ruined her legally, publicly. But maybe justice isn't about crushing people. Maybe it's about drawing the line, then offering a path forward. If this story struck a chord, leave a comment or hit like. It really does help more than you know. And if you'd like to support the channel, that little thanks button is there too. No pressure.